Welcome all to the 18th in my series of weekly restoration project presentations. This week I'd like to show you the restoration of quite a strange French clock movement. It was found on eBay in one of the remotest places you could imagine for a French clock. Stand by. For sale on eBay from the Orkney Islands, north of Scotland. It appeared to be a standard French round plate movement, except it had a platform escapement mounted on the front plate and a copper disc on the back plate underneath a ratty electric coil. There was no winding arbors, but it did have a hammer, so it was obviously a striking movement of some sort. Here's the front plate. As you can see, no winding arbors, but the lifting mechanism is there for a typical strike system, and the front plate with a mounted platform escapement. There were some problems in this platform escapement, as the escape wheel pivot had been broken off and one pallet stone was missing, so there was work to do in getting that part to work. Here's the back plate, showing that it was made by one of the Marty family, in this case Fritz. The Martys were very famous for making pendule de Paris clock movements. You can see the normal locking plate and hammer for the strike side, but there's a copper disc and an electric coil. I would have to find out more about this before I could proceed. The side view reveals that there is in fact a barrel. Only one. Does that do time and strike? No. There's a tiny barrel for the strike mounted behind the locking plate. This is strange. And also, there is a lever that can lock out the fan and stop the strike side from working. Why would you want to do that? This copper disc and coil must be some sort of motor, as a pinion comes through the back plate to a series of 5 gears, all running down to the mainspring barrel. Why? I was not familiar with this type of motor, which it obviously was, until I did the research and found out that it actually was a Ferraris motor. And they were very common in electricity meters up until recent years, because they were basically the component in an electricity meter which spins to drive the meter reading digits. In fact, the motor is an AC induction motor. And here's some of the history related to the development of that device. And in 1885, Galileo Ferraris of Italy was the first man to create a practical induction motor. Now you can see that it was not until the late 1800s that the distribution of electricity was established. And in 1900, Paris set up 6 power distribution districts with generating stations producing 3000 volt 50 hertz power. And that was just stepped down then to 110 volts and 50 hertz for domestic use. It wasn't until 1964 that France changed over to a 220 volt supply, but retained the frequency of 50 hertz. There's no doubt that this movement was made before 1964, so it would have been constructed for 110 volts and 50 hertz operation. To run that movement, I would need to step down from 240 to 110. I wouldn't need to worry about the frequency, as it's the same as our 50 hertz supply. And besides that, it wouldn't have mattered, because the movement would still run on 60 hertz. It would have just run a little faster, and it would have wound the mainspring sooner. so I could proceed with the restoration now, knowing the voltage required. The movement required a simple strip down, clean out, and rebuild servicing. The major problems were the broken pivot on the escape wheel staff and a missing pallet in the lever. I replaced and repaired both of these successfully. But while doing all this, I found that there was a little brake pad behind the copper disc of the motor on an extension from the barrel arbor, and I was soon to find out what that was all about. The Ferraris motor, mounted on the back plate of the movement, winds the mainspring in the large barrel. As the mainspring winds, a little follower on the back of the arbor, threaded onto the arbor, winds its way out with a rubber pad on the end of it. When the mainspring reaches full wind, that little pad comes up against the copper disc and stops the motor. So now it knows that the mainspring is fully wound, no more winding occurs. How does the striking system get any power? Well, the mainspring for the clockwork keeps the spring in the little barrel for the strike wound. So we have an electric motor maintaining the clock mainspring wound, and the clock mainspring keeps the little strike mainspring wound. Basically, it's a double remontoir movement. But what's the strike lockout lever for? Well, that's so that you can stop the strike mechanism from running until you get to a point where the little mini mainspring for the strike has received enough power to drive the strike system. Once it's fully wound, then you can let off the strike lever and everything will maintain itself in going condition. So here's the back of the movement after full restoration, and you can see I've taken much care in making sure that the coil is recovered and insulated, and the terminals on the top are fully insulated. The wiring that goes down through the brass tube into the bottom of the clock is double sheathed in woven cloth fabric tubing passing down through a brass tube. Not much chance of receiving any shocks. So this was quite a complicated and intriguing little movement with so many unusual features to make sure that the clock ran and struck reliably. Well, that's great. Now I've got a running movement without a case. So a little bit more research, and here is my preferred option. I would love to have a 4-glass case to fit my Ferraris driven clock movement. This is an option that I found, a nice oval case with a similar movement but no striking. Here's another example in a 4-glass case owned by someone who is obviously resistant to shocks. All these bare wires and bare terminals with 110 volts AC running through them is a bit of a worry if you have to go into the back of the case to do any adjustments. Notice also on this clock that the coil cover has got 110 volts written on it, justifying my original research into the requirements for powering this clock. My desires were to have a case and a dial that would display all of the operating functions and features of this movement. A sunk center dial with the center missing so that you could see the platform escapement. 4-glass case so you could see the operation of the Ferraris motor, and that's why a 4-glass case was preferred. And I did ultimately find both without much problem. Here you can see the result of a sunk center dial. The platform escapement is visible, and the Breguet hands set off nicely against the fine Roman numeraled porcelain enamel dial. Backplate is marked Electric Marty, patented in France and foreign countries. And there you can see the clock movement in the case with the gong and the power tube matched. Front and rear of the clock movement, beautifully displayed in the original full glass case. To be able to wind the mainspring, the Ferraris motor, being low torque, transfers that power from the motor through a series of gears, 5 in fact, such that by the time it gets to the mainspring, it's very low RPM but high torque. It never fails to amaze me that the variations and methods of applying electricity to clockwork is incredible. Thousands of clockmakers applied themselves, applying for patents, making prototypes and production models. There must have been a lot of people very smart applying themselves to this situation. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. The restoration and recovery of an orphan movement of unique design and construction, restored and placed back into a case that would allow it to be observed and appreciated. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions or comments, just send me an email to the address shown at the bottom of this page. Thank you.